Hello, welcome to Read Through the Word. My name is Dawn, and today is Saturday, February 8th. I am very glad to be on this journey with you as we continue through the book of Exodus today. Our key verse today is Exodus 23, verses 20 and 21. I'm going to send an angel in front of you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Be attentive to him and listen to his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. And I titled this lesson, Never Alone. This verse, looking at the original language, like other verses that sometimes talk about an angel or angel of the Lord, there are at times in translation, I guess, uncertainties as to exactly what this means. Some might say it meant it was the Lord, right? That the literal presence and spirit of the Lord was this messenger. And some say it was truly just an angel of the Lord. And there are multiple times in the Old Testament where this happens, where some kind of messenger has shown up. And there isn't exact certainty as to whether this was the Lord himself. So we do know that when God says this, he says, my name is in him. In other words, my name, my presence, who I am. Remember his name, Yahweh, I am, right? So his name, his very presence is going with them. It's not just a messenger who's like, oh, hey, I'm just here representing God. God himself put his name or his presence in him, which, like I said, it could be a translation that it was God himself, but we do know that the very essence of God and the power of his name was with the Israelites wherever they went. So it's really important to remember this when we look at the rest of the lesson today, which is a big list of rules. When we read parts of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, there's a lot of regulations, a lot of directions, a lot of guidance. And I just want to talk about a few. I just picked a handful of these seemingly random regulations that are listed in our reading today. And I just kind of want to give you some history about some of them. And then we will talk about their connection to the key verse we just read. So first of all, it talks in there about marriage, and it is important to know that in these ancient Near Eastern times, that for Israelites, families negotiated marriage contracts and a bride price. So the families would negotiate that. And betrothal was considered a legally binding contract. The bride price varied based on whether the woman was a virgin or had been married before. So her value rested on those things in ancient marriage practices. Premarital relations were discouraged, and we know that the sacredness with which God created the marriage relationship, so that makes sense to us. But it's also interesting to note that, again, historically, this also brought benefit practically to, I'm not saying it was right, I'm saying, excuse me, that it did bring sort of a practical benefit to the man that she was going to marry, and to the father, because these premarital relations were discouraged because and this is from the IVP Bible Background Commentary, it usurped the authority of the father to arrange the marriage. In other words, if the woman had already been with someone else, that was going to be a problem when the father wanted to be able to set the bride price. Also, and again, this quote here, it diminished the potential value of the bride price. And it also ensured that the firstborn child belonged to the husband. In other words, if the woman had a child with another man who wasn't her husband, and then she got married, that son would not belong to the husband she was married with. And it was a very important thing that, husbands, fathers wanted to be able to carry on. It was very important culturally for the husband, father, to feel like, he had an heir, he had a firstborn that was his. So obviously we do know that God did and does, he created the marriage relationship to be very sacred. But it is important to remember too, that in these ancient times, some of their cultural practices also rested on the practicality and benefit of the people negotiating this price for the marriage. So just an interesting fact. Some of the verses talk about caring for orphans, widows, and aliens. They were the most vulnerable people group in ancient Near East society and the most easily mistreated, oppressed, or abused. They were powerless to protect themselves. For example, women could not inherit their husband's property, and orphans were common due to the frequency of war and famine and disease. So there was never a shortage of orphaned children. And they were powerless to protect themselves. What's interesting is that other pagan nations also had statutes and strong rules about taking care of these vulnerable groups. In the Code of Hammurabi, for example, it expresses the importance of a ruler to protect the poor and the widow and the orphan. They were very vulnerable in this society. In the IVP Bible Background Commentary, it says, in this way, the vulnerable classes are provided for throughout the ancient Near East. Only the alien is not specifically mentioned outside the Bible. This is not to say that hospitality codes did not apply elsewhere, but this category is tied in the Bible to the unique Exodus experience. In other words, whenever God talks specifically about taking care of the alien, he links it to the fact that the Israelites were foreigners in Egypt. And so he links his care for the aliens with that experience. So that is unique to the Israelites. Some of the feasts. The Feast of Unleavened Bread signals the coming of the barley harvest in March or April. It may have been similar to Canaanite agricultural celebrations. There could be similarities, but for the Israelites, it was associated with the Exodus and the Passover. The Feast of Harvest, known as the Feast of Weeks, marks the end of the wheat harvest season, and by tradition, it could also be tied to the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, and there was an offering of bread. The Feast of Ingathering was the final harvest of the year in autumn, and the 7-day event is known as the Feast of Tabernacles, which you're probably very familiar with, symbolized by the construction of booths for harvesters, commemorating the wanderings throughout the wilderness, and it also marked the beginning of a new agricultural year. So, just some background into just a handful of some of these rules and regulations that were set forth in these chapters of Exodus. Now, here was the interesting thing to me. God did not set out a list of rules and say, here's your checklist, like, best of luck. You better follow these things, or, obviously there's consequences for when they broke the law. But God did something so much better than just give them rules. He said, I'm going with you. You're not doing this alone. You will not be expected to just go out on your own and try to figure all of this out, how you're going to live like this, how you're going to follow these rules, how you're going to how these rules are going to look in everyday society. It's not like God said, yep, go figure it out. He said, I am going with you. And he continues to speak to them, of course. Through his words, through other people, through prophecies, God continually speaks through his people. And the fact that, God has been with them all along, right? So as they left Egypt, there was, the pillar, there was the cloud, and then there was the fire by night. So God had already been going with them. This was not new. And he was saying, I'm sending an angel in front of you. My name is in him. So his very presence, his very nature, right? If not, he himself is with the Israelites. And that is the most important part of understanding these rules. God gave of himself. He never intended for us to just follow a set of rules, make a checklist, and call it good. He always meant to dwell with us, to be with us, and to make sure that we were never going to have to do all of this alone. Because that's who he is. He's love, and he created us to be with him. And when we dwell with God and with others in the kingdom of God, we can be strengthened by the Spirit of God in ourselves, and by the Spirit of God in others. We can be strengthened to follow all that God has called us to do because he's with us. He's always been with us. He did not leave the Israelites, and he will not leave us. Thanks for joining us here today, friend, on Read Through the Word, and we'll see you next time.